Hey there, my name is Emiliano. Welcome back to another episode of Book Club. Now, before I even introduce the book, let me warn you that I will be saying the F word a couple of times, and by a couple of times I mean that I will be counting here because the book that we're going to be talking about today is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. Now, the format will be the same as this one. If you haven't watched it, go check that out. The format will be the 3-sentence summary, impressions, how I discovered the book, who should read it, the book's impact, main takeaways from the book, and finally, my favorite quotes from the book. So without further ado, let's get into the 3-sentence summary. Right, so let's go through the 3-sentence summary. Not giving a fuck means being comfortable with being different. It means that you must care about something bigger than adversity, and it's also completely unavoidable. You're always choosing what to give a fuck about. There is no such thing as a life without problems. Your life will always have problems. However, don't despair. Happiness comes from solving problems. Solving good problems you enjoy. Happiness comes from caring about something greater than yourself. Believing you're a contributing component in some much larger entity. That your life is a mere side process of some great unintelligible production. So that's the 3-sentence summary of the book. But again, any book is so much more than just 3 sentences. This is a book filled with gems on basically everything. I really enjoy this book. On my Instagram, which you should go follow, I said that this might be the best book of the year so far. I guess we'll have to wait until the 2021 book review, but from now, this is the best book of the year. Anyway, moving on. So my first impressions of the book are that this book is magnificent. I love the book. I really enjoyed the book, and as soon as I put it down, as soon as I finished it, I instantly texted a few of my friends and I was like, you have to read this book. Mark Manson isn't preachy. He doesn't pretend to be a know-it-all. He doesn't pretend to have the key and the secret to the universe or to a happy life. It's funny, it's not preachy, it's not a self-help book per se. It's a great book. And some of the pages, some of the chapters are like a slap in the face. Honestly, especially the ones where he's highlighting bad behaviors or behaviors that we should avoid. I was like, oh my God, I've been that person. I've been the person doing that. And reading this was a great wake-up call because now I know what I've been doing wrong and I can more or less adapt and change so I could become a better person, or at least avoid doing the things that he says I've been doing wrong. So how I discovered the book, in 2018, I was walking through a library and I read it and I picked it up and I read the blurb right here. I was like, okay, this sounds like a great book. I really want to read this, but I didn't buy it then. Now, fast forward 3 years, 2021, I went to Barnes & Noble's in the US and I was like, okay, here it is. This is my chance to buy it. And I did. And it's, I think, one of the best purchases of the year, honestly. And the reason I bought it physically and I didn't buy the Kindle version is that I just wanted to be able to hold it and to like lend it out and to like highlight it. There are a few books like this and like this, video coming on these by the way, that you just have to own physically. So who should read this book? Honestly, I think everyone should read it. On my Instagram, which you should go follow, on my stories, I'm posting every book I read. And I said that this book was the best book of the year so far. I wish I had read this book sooner. So if you've been waiting for a sign, go read this book. But yeah, I think everybody should read it, especially people my age. So I'm 19, so teenagers, young adults, yeah. Young is my main directive. But yeah, it's a great read and I think everybody should try to give it a chance. So the book's impact. Honestly, this book has been so impactful and I'm really glad because, well, I've been trying for it to have an impact after I read it. So one of the things he says is that we should be constantly analyzing if we're wrong. So one of the things that I've incorporated into my life is to constantly ask myself, what if I'm wrong? I mean, it's working and it's truly a great exercise in uncertainty. He preaches a lot about uncertainty and how we should be uncertain more often because we don't know anything. He says that we're never right, we're just less wrong, which is great, I love that. But yeah, I've incorporated the what if I'm wrong question into my daily life. I'm enjoying it surprisingly because I don't like being wrong. I don't think anybody does. So yeah, what if I'm wrong is a great question. I'm also trying to be more selective about my fucks and the fucks I give and what or who I give them to. Plus, I've tried to internalize the entitlement chapter and the things he says about entitlement. It's not as easy as the what if I'm wrong because I'm constantly thinking about whether I'm wrong or right, but I'm not constantly thinking whether I'm entitled or not. I do want to think about that more often, but it's not as easy as some of the other things he says. And there's three main things that he says that have been quite impactful and that I'm trying to incorporate into my life. The first one is just thinking about our own mortality and considering that we're all going to die. It sounds a bit morbid, but it makes sense because it makes you zoom out and it gives you another perspective, and it's not supposed to be morbid. So I've been trying to think about death a bit more. It's not constantly, more like, okay, should I do this? Should I not do this? Should I send that text? Should I not send the text? Oh, it's fine, we're all gonna die, I'll send it. Within reason, obviously. And the second expression is, what pain do I want in my life? He says that it's very easy to ask, what do you want in your life? Because we all want the same thing. But if we were to ask ourselves, what pain do we want in our life? As in, what do we want to struggle to achieve? Well, then that's an even better question, and it's a question we should be asking, because we all want the same things, but we're not all willing to work for the same things. Which is a really clever question, and it seems so obvious when he puts it out there, but it's not something that had ever crossed my mind. And it's a question as to not what do you want, but what are you willing to struggle for, which is essentially the same question, or if you are completely congruent and coherent, should provide the same answer, but most likely they won't. And the third thing he says is just don't try, as in be okay with being average, being mediocre, being normal, because that is the mean, the average, the normal thing to be. Average. So we live in a society where being exceptional is a new normal, and everybody who's not exceptional is a failure. And as long as we realize that most of our lives are going to be just normal and boring, then we become instantly happier, because we're not competing, we're not trying to be exceptional, we're not trying to be the next Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or anything like that, because odds are you won't be. Like, statistically speaking, you won't be. And as long as you embrace that, and as long as you realize that it's fine to be normal and to be average and to be mediocre, then the happier you will be with the small things in life, which are what brings us fulfillment in the long run. So I'm gonna go through some of the main takeaways that I wrote down from Mark Manson. Not all of them, because then this video would be quite substantially longer. So the first one is, what does it mean to not give a fuck? Because the book is called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. He says three things. Firstly, he says that it doesn't mean being indifferent. It means being comfortable with being different. So it means that you don't care about pissing people off to do what you feel is right, important, or noble. And that it means that you know that there are more important things than embarrassment, failure, your feelings, your ego, your pride, and that you reserve your fuck for what truly matters, which is relationships, your purpose, etc. He says that to not give a fuck about adversity, you must give a fuck about something more important than adversity. So let me give you an example. If I, as a med student, made it my purpose to minimize the amount of sexism in the healthcare system, and then one of my teachers said something sexist, I should give more fucks about my purpose than I do about the fact that my teacher is my superior, and it might have he might hurt my feelings, or it might be like an ego thing or something. I would just say, sir, ma'am, stop, that was sexist, stop it, don't say that again. When in reality, what most of us would do is we'd say, oh, I could say something, but because of the power dynamics and stuff, well then he might hurt my feelings, or try to harm my possibilities of something, or he might hurt my chances or whatever. When if we gave a fuck about our purpose more than we give a fuck about our career prospects or whatever the term is, well then we would not hesitate to say it. Then he says that life is a form of suffering. We all suffer. The rich suffer because they're rich, the poor because they're poor, people without families because they don't have families, people with families because of their families. And that while not all suffering is created equal, and of course there are different levels of suffering and different magnitudes of suffering, life is suffering and we all must suffer nonetheless. He says that happiness comes from solving problems, not avoiding them. That to be happy we need something to solve, and that therefore happiness is a form of action. Then he goes on to say that happiness is a constant work in progress because solving problems is a constant work in progress. Then he says that the question, what do I want in life, is an easy question because we all have relatively the same answer. And he instead says that we should ask ourselves, what pain do I want in my life? And what am I willing to struggle for? Because those are the telling questions, or at least those questions will have a telling answer. Then he says that to succeed at something, you have to be in love with the process, not the result, which is the same point echoed in Austin Kleon's book, Show Your Work, point 2, if I recall correctly. He says that you should be in love with the fight, not the victory, the path, not the destination. And that's something that really resonates with me. Then he goes on to talk about the trauma we might suffer through, or humans might suffer through, and how the deeper pain we feel makes us feel like our problems are more and more unique, and therefore we grow entitled. because we feel like we have problems that we're incapable of solving, and that this makes us feel helpless and miserable, and that it makes us feel either uniquely special or uniquely defective. And in order to compensate for our feeling of helplessness, we become entitled and we internalize two different mindsets. Either I'm awesome and the rest of you all suck, so I deserve special treatment, or I suck and the rest of you are awesome, therefore I deserve special treatment. Then, this is a really important one, he talks about people accepting mediocrity and how people are afraid to accept mediocrity because it means that if they accept being mediocre, they'll never achieve anything in their lives. He says that this is not true, that the ticket to emotional health comes from accepting the truths, the hard truths of life. So for example, that our actions don't matter that much in the long run or in the grand scheme of things, that the vast majority of our lives will be boring and not noteworthy, and that accepting those is okay and thinking those is okay, but that it'll lift the constant pressure that we feel to be amazing, of being the next big thing. It'll alleviate the stress and the anxiety of feeling inadequate, and it'll relieve our own lofty expectations that we have of ourselves, and that we'll feel all the happier because of it. And that we will learn to appreciate the basic experiences of life that will bring even more happiness, like a simple friendship, creating something, helping a person in need, reading a good book, or laughing with somebody around us. Then he talks about the 3 layers of self-awareness. Outermost one, understanding one's emotions. The more internal one is the ability to ask ourselves why we feel certain emotions. And that these questions are important because they illuminate what we consider a success or what we consider a failure. And then the third and the innermost layer of self-awareness is the ability to analyze and examine our personal values. And it goes in hand with the second one because it allows us to analyze our values and why we consider things a success or a failure, like what value are we talking about in those circumstances. Then he talks about responsibility, and that often the only difference between a problem being painful or powerful is a sense of responsibility of it, is that you chose it. So he gives the example, I think, of running a marathon. If you propose to yourself that you want to run a marathon and you do it, you'll feel incredibly powerful and empowered and everything. But if somebody holds a gun to your head and it's like, you have to run a marathon, it'll be incredibly painful and it'll be a very hurtful and a very damaging experience. He then goes on to say that if you're miserable in your current situation, it's probably because you feel like it's outside of your control and that it was thrust upon you without choosing. And how when we choose our problems, we feel empowered, but when we feel like our problems are thrust upon us, we feel miserable and victimized. But then he goes on to say that we are responsible for everything that happens in our lives, no matter the external circumstances. We don't always control what happens to us, but we are responsible for how we interpret what happens and how we respond. He then goes on to explain the difference between fault and responsibility, and that a lot of people believe that being responsible means that they're at fault. But then he says that if somebody drops off a baby at your doorstep, it's not your fault that happened, but it's your responsibility what you do with the baby. He says that beliefs that support a why bother mentality are giving us moderate comfort now by mortgaging greater happiness and success later on. We're comfortable now, but we might be miserable later on. He coins his own law. He calls it Manson's law of avoidance. He says the more something threatens your identity, the more you will avoid it. Knowing you fit in the world is comforting. Anything that shakes up that comfort is scary. He says, don't find yourself, never know who you are. It's what keeps you striving and discovering. It forces you to remain humble in your judgment and accepting the differences in others. He says, redefine yourself, don't be special, don't be unique. Redefine yourself in metrics that are mundane and broad. Be a student, be a partner, a friend, a creator. Don't be a rising star, an undiscovered genius, a dismal failure, a horrible victim. Just redefine yourselves in normal terms. Then something that really stuck with me was the being less certain of yourself. Constantly asking myself, what if I'm wrong? What would it mean if I'm wrong? What would it mean for my values if I'm wrong? Would being wrong create a better or a worse problem for both myself and others? Then something that I've learned a lot, that is also my background picture from my phone, is he says that improvement is based on 1,000 failures, and the magnitude of your success is based more or less on how many times you failed. Somebody that is more successful has failed more times. Somebody that is less successful has failed less times. Fear of failure is confining, it's stifling. Fail, iterate, and you'll eventually succeed. So So by iterating, by doing things a lot of times, even if you fail, you will eventually succeed. It will just take time. Then one of my mantras that has been that I discovered before reading the book, but I still really, really like the fact that he included. He says that life is about not knowing and then doing something anyway. It never changes. So we never know what we're doing, and nobody ever knows what they're doing. We're just kind of improvising and going along as we go. And once we realize that nobody knows what they're doing, well then everything just becomes more free and more freeing. So the last 3 takeaways are that rejection makes our life better. If we don't reject anything and we embrace everything, we stand for nothing. And if we stand for nothing, we are empty and our life is meaningless. He talks about avoiding rejection as a way of giving us short-term pleasure, but it makes us directionless in the long run. We all have to give a fuck about something in order to value something. And to value that something, we have to reject that not something. Then, when talking about rejection, he specifies that breadth of experience is necessary and reliable when you're young, because you've got to discover yourself and your life, but depth is also important, and the rejection of alternatives is ultimately liberating and will lead to happiness and to the pursuit of good problems that we enjoy. And lastly, he finishes with how happiness comes from caring about something greater than yourself, believing you are a contributing component in some much larger entity, that your life is a mere side process of some great unintelligible production. Now, my favorite quotes are, "To not give a fuck is to stare down life's most terrifying and difficult challenges and still take action. The point isn't to get away from the shit. The point is to find the shit you enjoy dealing with." The problem with people who hand out fucks like ice cream at a goddamn summer camp is that they don't have anything really fuckworthy to dedicate their fucks to. Maturity is what happens when one learns to only give fucks about what's truly fuckworthy. He says, "Don't hope for a life without problems. There's no such thing. Instead, hope for a life full of good problems. Problems never stop. They merely get exchanged and or upgraded." Next, he says, "Everything comes with an inherent sacrifice. Whatever makes us feel good will also inevitably make us feel bad. What creates our positive experiences will define our negative experiences. Success is a never-ending upward spiral, and if you think at any point you're allowed to stop climbing, I'm afraid you're missing the point, because the joy is the climb itself." Next, he says, "It has become an accepted part of our culture to believe we're all destined to do something truly extraordinary. This statement is inherently contradictory. If everyone were extraordinary, then by definition, no one would be extraordinary." He says that our values determine the nature of our problems, and the nature of our problems determines the quality of our lives. He says, "Growth is an endlessly iterative process. When we learn something new, we don't go from wrong to right, we go from wrong to slightly less wrong." So number three is, when our highest priority is to make ourselves or our partners feel good, then nobody ends up feeling good, and our relationship falls apart without even knowing it. If we're unwilling to fail, we're unwilling to succeed. Certainty is the enemy of growth. Nothing is for certain until it has happened. Now, this was a long one, so thank you so much, guys, for liking, commenting, subscribing. I really appreciate it. I really think you should go check out this book and his blog. I'll leave everything about him linked in the description. You can check out the 2020 book review here. You can subscribe here in the middle and leave a comment down below, and I really appreciate it. Cheers!